Okay, so in the second part, we're going to look at top-down processing. So if we understand bottom-up processing as looking at the individual units and mining information from that, what is top-down processing? All right, so top-down processing is drawing upon knowledge of the world, topic, or culture. It's using schema. It's using your understanding to be able to understand, right? It's understanding literal meaning, also selecting relevant information, but deciding what's relevant, making inferences. If you don't have schema, you cannot make inferences. If you can't put two and two together, but that's really what's happening. It's you putting ideas together and making inferences. It's building meaning, and that's sort of the key of top-down processing. We're building meaning. Bottom-up processing is more of a mining details to extract meaning, but then the top-down processing is putting those meanings together with your schema and creating that general understanding, okay? So it's connecting those ideas. Top-down processing starts from the reader or the listener. It assumes that the learner brings to the text certain knowledge of the world of text and of language. So we're talking about schema here. This background information is likely to be used in understanding a text, whether it's written or spoken, but it often needs to be activated. We need to activate schema to be able to understand. The reader or listener relies on this knowledge for comprehension rather than relying on the actual words or sounds. So when you're doing top-down processing, you do inferences, you do guesswork, you sort of understand and you go like, I think it's because of that. But I think it's because of that is using your schema rather than looking at the paper and looking at the words and this says this, but what do I understand? And that is top-down processing. So activities such as predictions, discussions, questionnaires, brainstormings, and others can be used to do this. Let's do a couple of examples. So read the following headlines. What are these articles about? So we have this first headline. CDC calls for Americans to wear masks. So what is that story about? What do you think that story is about? Do you know what the CDC is? If you know what the CDC is, it gives you even more information about it. But they're talking about masks. Could this be a story about Halloween because you're wearing masks? Of course not. Everyone knows that this, even if you don't know what the CDC means, everyone knows that we're talking right now about masks for protecting yourself from COVID. That is clearly a COVID story, right? But does it say COVID in the title? It doesn't. But how do you know it's about COVID? It's because you're putting two and two together. You're putting what is there with your own schema and attaching meaning to it. That is top-down processing. Let's do one more. This one's in Spanish. Pasajero se opone a robo y mata a presunto delincuente. Well, obviously this happened in a Spanish-speaking country because the title is in Spanish, right? And where did it happen? You're probably going to say Guatemala, right? And it's pasajero, what do I mean? Oh, yes, it was definitely in the bus, right? Do you remember that story? I don't know if you remember that story. It didn't happen too long ago. And it's sort of like a natural occurrence. And I'm sure that when you read that, the first thing you thought was crime on a bus, right? And why did you think about that? Because you're applying your schema to what it says there. Now, look at this next one, for example. Saina Nehwal seeded 5th. PV Sindhu gets 9th seed for Rio Games. That's a little bit more difficult, isn't it? And why is that more difficult to understand what that story is about? What is that story about? The thing is, there is not enough schema, perhaps, and that's why it's more difficult to understand when you go like Saina Nehwal. What's that? It has to be a name because it's not English, right? And seeded 5th. What's that mean? Seeded 5th. All right, so you sort of go into bottom-up mode and start looking for words, specific words that give you meaning. So you go 5th, all right, and you go 9th. All right, those are numbers, right? Positions. and then games, okay, and then you go real games, and then you go top down, real games. That's probably something to do with so you got real games and places. It probably has something to do with the Olympics, and probably Saina Nehwal and Sindhu are people, right? And I don't know what seated mean, but it's something about Olympic Games or something like that, right? So you see how bottom up and top down sort of work. And it's when you apply the schema, right? When you look for the overall meaning, that top down really occurs. If we keep it bottom up, it would be, I know 5th and 9th are numbers. That's it. But trying to put those details together, and Rio is probably Rio de Janeiro, and Rio Games, so that is top-down processing, is trying to find the meaning because of what you know. Let me give you one more example. And then there were none. BCCI and state body administrators quit roles. What is that story about? I look at it and I have no idea what it was. I actually picked it a while ago, and I look at it today and I don't know what it is. And why don't I know what it is? Because I have no schema to connect to this. I cannot understand meaning, and therefore I cannot process it. My top-down processing doesn't work because there's no schema. I need schema for top-down processing. Now let's do a listening top-down exercise. I'm gonna play the first part of an audio where Leanne speaks, all right? And you are going to answer 2 questions. First question is, what did she forget and what did she do? In theory, there would be 3 people that we would listen to, but we're only going to listen to the first one, all right? So what did Leanne forget and what did Leanne do? Those are 2 questions. So here we go.
Tape script 11.9. Listen to the stories of Leanne, Jerry, and Keiko, and take notes about them in the chart. Leanne.
Last year, I graduated from college and I got a job in the same town. One day, for some reason, instead of going to work, which starts at 9 o'clock, I took the bus and went to the university for an 11 o'clock lecture. I was sitting there in the lecture room and I thought to myself, why don't I know anybody? Then, suddenly I remembered that I'd graduated already and that I was 2 hours late for work.
Okay, so let me ask you a question. Did you get the phrasing, Leanne forgot this? No, you did not. You did not get word for word. You had to take all the details and interpret. The text actually says she remembered she had graduated, right? So you need to take that and process it and understand it literally, but formulate it. So she actually forgot that she had graduated already and that she didn't go to the university, right? But nowhere in the text do they say that explicitly. So how did you understand it? How were you able to understand it if it wasn't said explicitly? And you understood it because you used top-down processing. You put 2 and 2 together to create meaning, right? And what did she do? She went to college instead of going to work, right? Did they say it exactly like that? No. Was it explained? Yes, but you need to understand the whole idea, understand the grand scheme of things to be able to pinpoint and to answer these questions. That is top-down processing. And now that's super important because when you're working with students, you don't want them to read and to listen and to do only bottom-up tasks. Bottom-up tasks are obviously important because they give you information about what is on the text, but you also want them to be able to understand and interpret and comprehend the text to be able to respond. And the only way they can do that is if they bring in their schema. And that is the whole point of understanding bottom-up and top-down processing. Students need to learn to be able to use both, to be able to understand what is going on, to process in order to be able to respond. Most people would agree that we use a combination of the 2 approaches when we are processing a text. We tend to switch from one to another as is needed. But whereas it used to be thought that we revert to bottom-up processing when we are unable to use top-down, research actually suggests that in fact, the opposite is true. If you are in a noisy cafe, for example, and cannot decode what your friend is saying, so you cannot go bottom up to look at the word for word, you tend to fill in the gaps with your knowledge of the world or your friend's usual speech habits. So for example, you're sitting in this noisy cafe and there's like 100 people there, and you get all that noise. And then you're talking to your best friend, right? And you got together because he needed to vent out because he just broke up with his girlfriend, right? So in the middle of the conversation, you can't hear what he's saying, but he goes, this and that, and you go like, sí, que desgracia, right? You didn't hear, but you understand the situation. And with your schema, you interpret that he is complaining about her. So you just respond to what you think he's saying. And what you think he's saying comes exactly from his schema. And that is what we do a lot in the world in real life. We do use bottom up in real life. Like for example, when we ask someone, wait, did you say can or can't? Right? So those looking at little elements for you to be able to understand better are bottom up. But when we assume and when we try to interpret the situation, we're using top-down processing. So let's do this last exercise here. And this is Where's Waldo? Imagine that the Where's Waldo is actually a text. So imagine this, and all the details there are words, right? So this is another analogy. But if I present you with one question, like these questions right here, which of these questions would be bottom up and which would be top down? So for example, let's look at how many beach balls can you see? So if we start counting the beach balls, is that bottom up processing or is that top down processing? If you guessed bottom up processing, you would be right because you're not actually looking at the whole idea of the picture. You're just looking for beach balls in the picture. And if you start looking and whatever, for example, if you look at a person and then that person is not a beach ball, so you just keep going, right? So you keep going until you find the details that you're looking for, the details that you're mining for. Next question, where are all these people? What's the answer? The answer is the beach. Someone else could have said a lake. Someone could have said Puerto San Jose, right? So what's happening here? What you're doing here is you're looking at everything and putting one on one together, but also with your idea. So for example, if you said Puerto San Jose, that's very schema related, right? If you said a lake, why did you say a lake? Or no, it's not a lake, it's the beach. Why did you say the beach? Maybe if you lived in a place that has a lake and people do these sorts of activities, then you would have said, oh, that's the lake, right? Because you're attaching schema to be able to answer these questions, all right? This question specifically. So next question, why are these people here? I'm not gonna look at the answer. The answer could be many things, but is the question bottom up or top down? It's definitely top down because you're looking at something that the picture doesn't tell you. You have to assume. So what was your answer? A lot of people say, oh, it's Semana Santa. Aha, that's your schema telling you that that's why they're there. Other people might say, oh, that's COVID is over and everyone's going to the beach. If you don't attach schema to this question, you cannot answer it, right? If you don't interpret the details and then just put more of yourself in it, you cannot answer that. All right, next question. What color is the sand? Very specific. You only have to look at one thing, and that's the sand. Ignore everything else. You're mining for that detail. Then it's bottom up. Where's Waldo? That's definitely also bottom up. I don't know where he is, but he's in there, I promise you. Okay, so to end, both forms of processing function simultaneously and are mutually dependent. You need both to be able to understand. So listening and reading can be seen as an interactive model in which linguistic information, contextual clues, and your prior knowledge or schema all play a part in comprehension. So you mine for these details, put them together, put your schema into it, and reach comprehension. So you're doing both all the time. To wrap up, what is top-down processing? It's sort of like, think of, what did he mean, right? It's not what he said, but what he meant. It's your understanding of the story, your interpretation, because you're using your schema to interpret. Whereas bottom-up is, how did he say it, or what words did he use, the individual elements in the text. So to wrap up, we go back to the trees. So bottom-up processing is basically the tree, right? Where you're just looking at the details and you're going to mine those details to get meaning. But top-down processing is looking at the forest, looking at the whole picture, and being able to extract the meaning of the whole thing by putting everything together, those details that you mined, and putting your prior knowledge and your schema together. I hope that this helps you understand what bottom-up and top-down is, and we're going to talk more about it in class.